Hello, I'm Nick Herriman, author of The Entangled State. Welcome to my series 25 Concepts in Anthropology. Today I'm going to talk about the concept of embodiment. Now to start with, I want you to consider the way an Australian male might walk. This is something like this. You put your chest out and your chin up, and this is a way of showing your proud, possessive masculinity. Now we'll compare this the way a Javanese man might walk in front of other men, and that's with his left hand behind his rear, his front palm facing down and bowing over and walking like this. This is a particular case if he's in front of elders. So on the one hand, you have a way of moving that is quite natural to me and a lot of my friends who actually walk with this kind of arrogant gait, which expresses, if you like, Australian ideas of masculinity and macho, and a Javanese ideal of masculinity, which is one of peace, reverence, and homage, if you like, to the elders. So if you like, there are different ways of moving, and these ways of moving become habitual for us. And this is part of the idea of embodiment, that cultural values become natural to the way we move. Okay? The next important thing is that this happens mostly unconsciously. An example of this might be a Japanese person talking on the phone. They'll be going, "Hai, hai, hai, wakarimashita, wakatta, wakarimashita," like this. So they'll be bowing even though there's nobody to see them. It might seem a bit silly from an outsider's perspective, but anthropology is not concerned with the outsider's perspective by itself. We also want to look at the insider's perspective. And in this way, this is, again, it's a way of showing reverence. But the interesting thing is it's not to display to anybody. The feelings come up quite habitually and naturally. So if you like, culture enters our bodies and changes the way they move. It also changes the actual physical body. You might notice that my head angles slightly to the right. This is a result of years and years of playing cello, where I was, and my action's no good anymore. I had to tilt my head slightly to the right to allow for a fingerboard, and this movement becomes quite natural to me. And so if you like, you can think of embodiment as a kind of cultural muscle memory. The ways of moving become so natural that they become internalized. So that's the culture coming in, but it also affects the way we perceive the world. And the way, this is important, it comes from the ideas of phenomenology. Now, phenomenology belongs to a philosopher by the name of Merleau-Ponty, a French philosopher, but the idea's been picked up by anthropologists. The basic idea from Merleau-Ponty is that in order to have experience, in order to have perception, you need to have a body in space. There's no perception without a body in space. So all your subjectivity, all your experience is based on having a body. Anthropologists thought, yes, this is an interesting idea, but what if that body is actually cultural? What if that body is a socialized body? And what we've come to find is that it's not only just movements that become habitual, but our very way of perceiving the world. And the famous example of that comes from an anthropologist named Michael Jackson, who's based in New Zealand. He talked about lighting a fire, and if you're like me, you light a fire. You start with, if it's in Australia, some dry eucalypt leaves as kindling, and put a few bigger sticks on top, and then a few more on top, and then build it up larger and larger sticks. Now, amongst the Kuranko in Sierra Leone, you don't light a fire like that. The women there are very careful. They'll only use 1 or 2 sticks at a time and burn it quite slowly. Now, Michael Jackson didn't realize this at first and actually made these big fires, and everybody thought it was quite funny. After a while, when he started to copy them, he realized how effective and efficient their way of burning was. And he came to also realize the lack of fuel, the lack of firewood around, and the way that actually changes experience and the way one moves. So in other words, by lighting a fire, Michael Jackson got an insight into the culture once he started lighting the fire the correct way. It might sound amazing, but I've actually done field work with Australian Aboriginal guys who reckon they can spot 5 years later a white fella's fire and a black fella fire, a white fella and black fella fire, because they're slightly different just by looking at the ashes. So it's not only culture coming in and changing the way we move, it actually changes the very way we perceive the world. Okay, one other way of thinking of this is in relation, if you took an example, let's say, identical twins. Raise one in an Orthodox Jewish community, say in St Kilda in Melbourne or in Brooklyn in New York. Get the other one and raise her amongst the Azande of the Sudan. Now, pick them up 20 years later, you'll find, of course, the way they talk is different, but the very way they walk, the way they sit, the way they communicate would be different. And even their physical body would be different. If they were boys, they might be circumcised. If they're girls, they might have all like scarification depending on the culture. So this is the idea of embodiment. Our bodies are changed by culture, and that changes, and because our bodies are necessary for perception, that changes the way we experience the world. I'll say it one more time. The idea of embodiment is that culture changes our bodies. As our bodies are necessary for the experience of the world, we experience the world through our bodies. That means culture changes the way we experience the world through our bodies. I'll give you one final example, and this comes from Mandy Thomas, an anthropologist who works on Vietnamese migrants in Australia. And she talked about a Vietnamese woman in a park, an old woman who'd recently migrated, apparently, to Australia, who sat on her haunches something like, I don't know if you can see this, but something like this. Now, this way of sitting is quite inappropriate in a Western context, and even might imply something quite, for us, quite embarrassing. However, for the Vietnamese woman, this was a natural way to occupy space. And you can see this if you go to a multicultural park anywhere in the world. You'll see, for example, Anglo and Western families taking their clothes off and lying in the sun, for example. Let's say maybe Muslim families staying covered up. Indonesian families, from where I do field work, seeking shade, trying to get out of the sun's rays. There's different ideas of how a body should activate and relate to the space around it. And these ideas are almost all tacit, that is, all taken for granted. So I've talked about phenomenology and embodiment. There's one more term I want to talk about today, and that's habitus. This refers to gestures, mannerisms, tastes, etc. But it tends to specifically refer to things like ethnicity and class within a culture. So, for example, in Australia, if you're upper class, you might say E, F, G, H. If you're lower class, you might say E, F, G, H. H or H. You might prefer wine, if you're upper class, to beer. You might listen to a classical radio station as opposed to a pop radio station. You might drive a European car as opposed to an Australian car. You might prefer European movies to Hollywood movies, etc., etc. So this is like within an urban context, upper and lower class. But you can also get between, for example, urban and rural. Rich farmers in Australia tend to drive Land Rovers. They wear hats, cowboy-style hats called R.M. Williams, and boots by R.M. Williams too. They might wear moleskins, a special kind of trouser, and they might adopt a special way of talking. They might say too right, where an upper class inner city person would never say too right seriously. Now, I might be a bit stereotypical here, but if anthropologists can study this quite carefully, we can see the way these mannerisms and tastes and other things reflect distinctions, particularly hierarchical distinctions within society. And that's specifically the idea of habitus. So the relationship between habitus and embodiment is something you have to develop a feel for over time. But you could think of it like a Venn diagram with intersecting circles. There's a lot of stuff in the middle that could be considered both habitus and embodiment. However, embodiment tends to refer more to things about the culture in general, where habitus tends to refer more to divisions within the culture. Okay, once again, please come and visit us at La Trobe's Melbourne campus here in Bundoora. As you can see, it's a very beautiful place. Please also purchase my book, The Entangled State, and you can find how I apply these ideas to a case of sorcery killings in Indonesia. And also, please stay tuned to my 25 concepts in anthropology.